Hi guys. As a returning point of contact for our class, I wanted to highlight a landscape that I've worked in for a couple of decades now that I think might provide some opportunities for case studies and examples and references. So I thought I would give a little intro to the Black River in South Carolina as a point of contact for this class. I think my slides are slow in advancing. So this landscape is one that has been of interest to the conservation community in South Carolina for quite some time. There's a quiet but consistent sort of effort to maintain the natural communities of this region. There's a relatively small human population interacting with this landscape, but also I would say a sincere conservation ethic of the people that live in this landscape to both protect and celebrate this place. So in defining what the priorities might be for this landscape, a couple of years ago, my organization that I work with in my day job, Open Space Institute, held a stakeholders meeting with about 30 leaders in the community. It included everything from the NGOs, the conservation NGOs working in this landscape, some of the resource agencies that interact here, community leaders, outfitters, community members at large, all gathered to really discuss and define what they saw as the value of this place. And I think this relates well back to the intro lecture of, how do we, what's the lens in which we define the values of a certain place. So in discussing this, we focused in on really what is the navigable portion of this riverine watershed, about 600,000 acre area. The navigable portion of this watershed includes maybe 140 river miles. When we talk about river miles in landscape ecology, we often have to double the river miles because we might be talking about shoreline along a river, and that means counting both sides of the river. So we discussed in this meeting some of the intrinsic values of this place. It's some of our understanding of how organisms, besides humans, are using this place. We had nice spatial data that gave us a sense of the forested wetlands within the area, intact forested wetlands along the rivers, streams, and creeks that really define this landscape. So you can see here in kind of a teal color, we were able to spatially map forested wetlands. Interacting with the forested wetlands are the upland areas that much of that upland matrix is comprised of planted pine. There is a push for native ecosystem longleaf pine in this area, as well as agricultural lands. We have some pocosin habitat showing up in this area, which is isolated wetland depressions. For those of you from the southeastern United States, you might know about the really unique Carolina Bay wetlands we have up in this sort of northern portion of this landscape. Some really cool examples of Carolina bays. So a good understanding of the extent, distribution, and rarity of some of those natural systems. There are a few species that I think we might consider focal species in this geography, and we often see in conservation planning, I would say, that sometimes just a few umbrella or focal species are elevated. Those are ones that we might have a better understanding of, we might have more data for, they might be more charismatic. We might have an understanding that if we plan for or protect for one given species, that they can be an umbrella for many other species. So in this landscape, coastal black bears are a species of interest. They're one that we have a good amount of information on. And this is an example of a model that was created in cooperation with a group called the Wildlands Network that shows terrestrial habitat connectivity that may support black bears in this region. Here's a little bit of a different form of data. We also know that wading birds and wood storks are species of concern and interest in this landscape. And so we have very downscaled, explicit data that tells us where wading bird rookeries are, and how many birds are in each of these rookery sites. And we also have an understanding of sort of the circumference around each rookery that might be important as foraging area for these birds. So it's cool to kind of compare and contrast that modeled data of black bear use and the much more explicit inventory data of wading bird rookeries in this landscape. So terrestrial resilience really deserves its own lecture. This is something we'll, I think, probably return to at some point in the semester. But in summary, this concept of terrestrial resilience was developed by the Eastern Division of the Nature Conservancy in an effort to prioritize lands for protection that were most likely to sustain biodiversity into the future with climate shifts and changes. And it's built on two principles. One is that diversity is distributed across the landscape in relation to geologic diversity. And two, diversity is most likely to be sustained in those places where we have the greatest landform and geologic diversity, and where we have connectivity to allow organisms to shift and change with the pressures and changes that we anticipate with climate change. So it's a cool concept. It's one that was supported by several papers and study. One of the ways this is summarized is to protect the stage and not the actors. This model does not consider the current distribution of species at all. It really relies on our principal understanding of where biodiversity exists on the landscape and how that relates to soil types and landforms. So if we can protect the stage, and the actors can shift and move and persist into the future. That was more long-winded than I intended. But you can see that in this kind of landscape, in a relatively flat somewhat homogeneous landscape in the coastal plain, a lot of that diversity and connectivity is found along the river systems that that we know are important for so many other reasons. So we can also map and consider some of the human values within this landscape. And this is maybe more in line with the European model of landscape ecology, and where we now see some of the North American thinking converging with that European view. So what are ecosystem services? We can look at landscapes through the lens of species, as we just did, and think about their intrinsic value to serving and helping to support biodiversity. And then we can look at those same areas for the services that they're delivering to human populations, both at the local scale and at much broader scales. So we know ecosystem services would include things like stored carbon, water quality, improved water provisioning and quantity over time in times of drought. It offers flood storage in times of flooding. It can offer access for recreation, securing cultural sites, and security from drought and disaster. So we can look at this spatially as well. There are many, many models and tools that help us understand how some of these services are unequally distributed across the landscape, and areas that may be more important to secure and protect and to restore than others. One such model is the Watershed Priority Index that helps us understand what places within a landscape might be most important for contributing to source water protection towards higher water quality. And so on this map, those areas in the lighter color shades of blue are the more important for conservation priority, and as we move toward the warmer colors, those are the areas that are contributing less. So this flood exposure index gives us a sense of where socioeconomic concerns meet flood concerns, and folks that are most likely to be exposed and vulnerable during flood events. We have some understanding of the distribution of cultural resources across this landscape just by looking at the National Register of Historic Places. And then we have an understanding of working forest lands within this landscape. So places that might be economically important for wood products, sort of our wood basket within this landscape, but this also represents a single ownership scenario where, for conservation purposes, we can work with a single entity to define and perhaps protect some of the natural habitats that are most important within the landscape. We have an understanding of what some of the current recreational assets are. Where within this landscape do we have areas that that the human population can actually go out and enjoy and interact with the natural world and the cultural resources there? And then we have some really interesting models and predictions on threats and a forward-looking view of how humans might further influence this landscape. So this is a model based on connectivity, actually, to existing urbanization within an area that predicts where we will see future human impact. So if you watch, you get a sense of where we're most likely to see parcelization and urbanization in the landscape into 2100. We might have really good explicit spatial data that shows us where we have issues with invasives and non-native species control. We have, in this case, very downscaled data that shows us where the South Carolina DNR is having to work on invasive species treatment, specifically an invasive called water hyacinth. So just a sampling of the types of data that we might use to understand elements of a landscape, and also the competing values and views that we might use to prioritize our actions there. So in this particular meeting, we moved into a discussion about what do folks want to emphasize in the in this place as far as values go. So we talked about what wildlife or habitat values do folks think should inform conservation efforts here. We had a strong interest, I was somewhat surprised by this, in emphasizing wildlife corridors and movement within this landscape, and I thought that was an interesting outcome, because implicit in this is, of course, that multiple wildlife species would benefit from an emphasis on connectivity of natural habitats. We talked about what might be the most important human well-being values to emphasize, and we saw real interest in recreational opportunities, drinking water protection, and flood mitigation. What stressors or threats should be addressed here? Interestingly, folks were most concerned with littering and human impact, which makes sense to me. I think it's a very visual impact in a landscape where you have that problem. It's immediate. It's not something they think about as being a distant threat, as we sometimes think about with things like climate change or development and parcelization into the future. And what recreational opportunities did people want to see here? They wanted to see additional river access points, canoe kayak trails, riverside hiking and biking opportunities. So this group went on to think about what next step priorities might be within the landscape, and these are some of the ideas that came out of that.